Hello, my name is Priyanka. From the time I was a little girl, I've always loved adventure. Traveling to a new city or country helps me discover not just the world, but most importantly, myself. Tonight's story is about just such a journey and a surprising friendship that happens along the way. But before we begin, let's take a moment to relax and unwind. Draw in a few deep, full breaths that flow through your body and your mind, allowing you to feel at ease. Now join me as I begin tonight's sleep story, the tale of Talisha. The day she met the kingfisher seemed like any other. Talisha lounged in her favorite hammock in a simple house upon the beach, where the turquoise waves of the Caribbean strummed the shore with their eternal cadence. A step outside her door was a velvety carpet of golden sand, cool from the ocean's gentle waters. She lived in this house all her life with her parents Javel and Flor, who had started a family in this far northern corner of Colombia when they were a young couple, not much older than Talisha. Javel spent his days upon the ocean waves and his evenings repairing fishing nets, glasses perched on the end of his nose. Flor cooked savory meals and wore long, floral dresses with vivid patterns in every color of the rainbow. Talisha made woven bracelets from delicate strands of dyed cotton, sometimes even silk. She wore a very special one on her wrist in the colors of her home: the yellow sand and the azure sea, the vast blue sky and the soft pink flamingos, the deep red sun setting behind the golden dunes. Talisha had never left this sandy peninsula where the desert meets the sea, though she loved to dream about faraway places. In her imagination, she would climb snow-capped mountains, stroll down cobblestone streets, and trek through the rainforest. But days turned into weeks, and months turned into years. Talisha couldn't find a reason to break her cherished rhythms. Who would greet Javel on the beach when he returned home from fishing? Who would mend the broken threads on Flor's embroidered skirts? Perhaps it was best that Talisha stayed where she was, in a comfortable place with the simple life she understood so well. One day, Talisha traveled to the nearest town, the farthest she ever went from home. She took this journey once a week to sell her woven bracelets in the marketplace. Under thatched awnings, she would chat with other women as they sold an array of handicrafts. Everything from the colorful bracelets she braided to traditional shoulder bags known as mochilas. Sometimes she stood at the edge of town where the main street merged with the highway. As her eyes followed the stream of cars and trucks cruising by, she wondered what grand adventures were in store for them, down the road that seemed to go on forever. On this day, the day Talisha met the kingfisher, She sat on the roadside in the shade of a large tree, watching the world go by. And so it was that she was perfectly positioned to see a wooden box slip off the back of an old truck with a jumble of packages tied under a canvas tarp. The box fell gracefully to the ground and slid onto a grassy patch that provided a soft landing. It was almost as if it meant to leap off. Talisha waved her arms at the truck, beckoning it to come back. But it disappeared down the highway, a trail of dust, the only evidence of its existence. Talisha hunched down, her knees pressing into the grass, and picked up the box. It was clean and new, crafted of light pine with several small holes in the side. But it had no label on it, no address or marking of any kind, and the holes were too tiny to see inside. She shook the box, and to her surprise, it seemed to shake back at her. Talisha shook the box again, and the box shook back again. Now Talisha was becoming very curious. She put her ear against the smooth wood and heard a rustling sound from within. She simply had to know what was inside. So she gently slid the lid all the way off. She couldn't believe her eyes. Inside the box was a cage made of soft wire. And inside the cage, resting on a nest of grass, was the most beautiful bird Talisha had ever seen. The stunning creature had a belly of soft white, with a kiss of shimmering copper across his chest. The plumage on his head and wings blossomed with deep teal, which glinted jade green or rich blue as it caught the sunlight. His long, pointed beak was black as coal, and his eyes shined like gemstones in the dark. He opened his beak and let out one strong chirp. Talisha recognized immediately. He was an Amazon kingfisher. Tied to the wire cage was a little note with one simple line: Manu National Park, Peru. That was half a continent away. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" Talisha said, and she almost expected the bird to reply. So wondrous did his sudden appearance feel to her. Looking a little closer, Talisha noticed that one of his tiny wings was wrapped in a white bandage. He seemed to be hurt, and Talisha knew what she must do. Over the next few weeks, Talisha devoted all her attention to the kingfisher. She found a bowl that was deep enough for his long beak to drink water. She carefully changed his bandages, taking the greatest of care with his delicate wing. And she wasn't the only one who fell in love with the darling bird. Flor made a fluffy bed of soft scraps of fabric so that he may rest outside his cage. And every afternoon, Javel brought home an assortment of seeds, which he fed to the bird with all the tenderness in the world. Despite his dainty size, the kingfisher had a spirited way about him. Though he mostly slept, he also noticed every sound and every movement. And he sang with a musical trill, perhaps his way of telling stories of faraway lands. Talisha had never felt happier caring for this bird. But every now and then, she would study the note from the wooden box. She read the address, Manoon National Park, Peru. She felt as though it was calling her to return him to his homeland. At last, the day came when Talisha knew she had to go. The sky glowed a pale violet with the last light of the moon, melting away into the same vivid blue as the kingfisher's plumes. As lulled as she was by her old rhythms, Talisha knew it was time for a new tempo. When she told Javel and Flore of her plan, they seemed to have been waiting for this day too. Javel bid her a warm farewell, offering blessings for a rich adventure. But Flore didn't say anything. She simply went into her room and returned a moment later with a mochila in her hands. Flore held out the cherished bag, telling Talisha this was the first mochila she ever made, many moons ago. Her mother taught her how to weave it, and it took her almost a full month to complete. She had been saving it for a special occasion, just like this one. Talisha held the piece of woven art in her hands. The design was incredibly intricate, full of different shapes that formed a mesmerizing pattern. But even more astonishing were the colors. It was as though Flore had known all those years ago that an Amazon kingfisher would one day float into her life. For she had woven the bag in the very same shades as the beloved bird, bands of deep teal blending together with threads of copper and white. Talisha's eyes widened at the precious gift, but Flore told her, with a smile, that the gift was not for her. A few pieces of the softest fabric were arranged at the bottom to form a cozy bed for the kingfisher on his journey home. The bird seemed to know already that this gift was for him. He hopped right inside, let out a long peep, and tucked his beak contently behind his wing. And so, Talisha kissed her parents goodbye and turned away from the comfort of home, away from the beauty of the desert, away from the pulse of the sea. She boarded a bus that would take her over the vast unknown on a journey to the land the kingfisher called home. As the bus rolled down the narrow highway, Talisha studied the landscape outside the window. At first, the view was a familiar one. The desert road was long and straight, blown over with powdery sand and lined with spindly trees. But ever so slowly, the world began to change. It took on more color and life, like the dawn sky gradually filling with light. The trees became more lush and bore fruit of every kind. Golden mango and sweet papaya hung heavy from bright, silky boughs. Graceful coconut palms opened their feathery fronds like a celebration. Talisha could glimpse the round thatched roof homes of villages hidden away in the hills. For a moment, she could almost hear the laughter of children and smell the soothing scent of wood smoke drifting in the air. The earth began to swell higher around them as the bus continued on its way. Before her eyes, Talisha watched rolling hills grow into the mighty Andes Mountains, rugged and tawny, with distant summits dusted with snow. The kingfisher had slept soundly through their journey. Talisha kept the mochila on her lap and rolled down the woven sides to watch him rest. He lay perfectly still, eyes closed, wings tucked in tight, with only his tiny copper chest rising and falling with each breath. And his gentle weight in Talisha's lap was a reassuring presence. Sometimes the kingfisher chirped in his sleep, his long beak open wide. Talisha wondered if he dreamed of his far-off home, which was getting closer each day. Somewhere along the dusty road, Talisha dropped the small metal tin that held the kingfisher's birdseed. The colorful seeds scattered down the aisle, across the floor of the bus, sounding like a rain shower. Talisha tried to pick up the seeds one by one, but they were too tiny and scattered too far under the seats. Then she felt a small tap on her shoulder, and Talisha looked up to see a small, smiling face framed by two long, dark braids. The little Peruvian girl was dressed in the most beautiful clothes Talisha had ever seen. A white lace shirt, a red shawl, and a blue skirt trimmed with a multicolored band which looked embroidered by hand. Rows of beaded bracelets decorated her wrists, and her palms were filled with a heap of dried corn, purple and red and gold, a handful of little jewels. "For your bird," her little voice offered. Talisha smiled. She thanked the girl for her help and asked if she wanted to feed the bird his lunch. The girl nodded earnestly and climbed into the seat right beside Talisha. The kingfisher suddenly wasn't so sleepy anymore. Every time the bird was eager to eat, Talisha sighed with relief. It was a sign that his wing was healing, and he was regaining his strength. He gobbled up the dried corn with quite an appetite. After his meal, the satisfied bird preened his feathers, took a brief look around the bus, and then returned to his nest and went back to sleep. Soon, the girl reached her destination. Talisha wanted to give her something as an expression of thanks. She searched in her backpack, but all she had were a few items of worn clothing. Then Talisha looked down at her wrist and saw the friendship bracelet she'd worn for so long. It was frayed and dusty, yet it felt like a part of her, a piece of the desert she loved so much. It was all she had, and Talisha thought the kingfisher would have liked the girl to have it. So she tied it around the girl's wrist, knowing that she didn't need a bracelet to remind her of home. Not long after, the bus crossed the border into Peru. As if he could sense his home growing closer, the little bird began to stir more often in Talisha's lap. Sometimes he even perched for a while on the folds of the mochila, looking about with his bright, clear eyes. Whenever he looked up at Talisha, she wondered what he might be trying to tell her. At last, the bus arrived in a small port town, set along the banks of a wide, flowing river. As Talacia stepped off the bus, the kingfisher let out a sweet little call. He seemed to understand where they were going. All around them, the world immediately felt different. The desert air of Colombia had been warm and dry. Now the cool mist along the river spoke of a new landscape, a lush, teeming rainforest where the mountains met the river. Talacia made her way into the riverbank, where a row of long, narrow boats were moored along the shoreline. The captain of the first boat had kind, brown eyes and wore black rubber boots that almost came up to his knees. Talacia showed him the address on the note, Manu National Park, Peru. He smiled and told her the park was just up the river and he would be happy to take her there. Resting back in the boat, Talacia cradled the kingfisher gently in her lap. The captain started the motor, and a steady rumble filled the air. The course of the river wound inland, past banks lined with thriving trees, strung with garlands of liana vines. Rolling green hills rose up behind them, a wispy layer of clouds shrouding the jungled slopes. The kingfisher was more attentive than ever, seeming to recognize every sound, every smell. Talacia, too, leaned forward, taking it all in. The rushing river was so different from the expansive sea. The vibrant green jungle was so unlike the sandy gold of the beach. The desert sun felt so distinct from the soft, wet air on her skin. Just like home, birdsong filled the air. But here, the melodies were wild and unbounded, the sound of a place where birds were the natural order of things. Talacia realized she had often lay in her hammock, dreaming of a place just like this, of untold jungles and rushing rivers that carried so much possibility. She gazed down at the little bird, no bigger than her palm, who had made her dreams come true. She explained her mission to the captain, and he nodded with a gentle smile. There are many other kingfishers here, he told her, and the bird would feel right at home. The captain had grown up in these jungles, in a small village set deep inside the park. And this world was as much his home as it was the kingfisher's. He knew these waterways like the back of his hand. Each crevasse and soaring peak, each ancient tree and curling vine, every call and every sigh. He spent his lifetime learning this landscape and spoke of it as if it was his dear friend. He had never left the jungle, and he never wanted to. He was a part of it, and it a part of him. Without a word, the captain motioned for Talacia to look towards a group of trees on the riverbank. At first, she saw only a tangle of branches and leaves, no different from the rest of the foliage lining the river. But the captain whispered for her to wait. After a few moments, Talacia saw the reason why. A mother woolly monkey appeared within the leaves. moving slowly down a branch. On her back, she carried her baby with tiny hands and downy fur. The kingfisher could see them too, and he nestled deeper into Talasia's safe embrace. Soon, they were joined by a family of river otters who swam up close and circled the boat, letting out happy squeals as they played. The youngest otters were most playful, sliding down the muddy banks before chasing each other back into the water. And then, as they neared a bend in the river, a new sound filled the air. A chorus of chirping, followed by a rushing of wings. From the forest, a beam of color flew across the sky, a streak of the richest red, the brightest blue, and the deepest greens. Talasia watched in wonder as a scarlet macaw glided towards their boat and landed right on the captain's shoulder. He smiled at the bird, as though not surprised one bit, explaining that he'd known this macaw since he was a boy. They'd grown up together. The macaw was one of his oldest friends and always had a way of finding him, no matter where he was in the rainforest. Just then, the mochila began to stir on Talasia's lap. She looked down and saw the little kingfisher hopping from one side of the bag to the other, about to open his wings. He began to chirp as well, in short, rhythmic calls, as though he wanted to join in the conversation. It was the first time Talasia knew exactly what he was trying to say. As the boat floated along the river and the setting sun began to flood the air with golden light, she imagined the kingfisher extending his teal wings and taking flight. It seems, Talasia thought, he might be ready to go. She looked down at the kingfisher, and the little bird looked right back at Talasia, sharing a silent moment only they understood. The captain slowed the motor until they were simply drifting along the river, close to its shores. He pointed out a faint path that rose up the hill before them that disappeared into the rainforest. Talasia thanked her guide, got off the boat, and took her first steps into the jungle. The ground was soft beneath her feet as Talasia followed the path into the unknown. The air was cool, the sky was violet, and the moon was beginning to rise above the trees. And then, amidst the birdsong, she could hear the steady flow of water. They must be getting close. The path widened before it opened into a breathtaking scene. Here was the place the captain mentioned, Butterfly Falls. There were hundreds of butterflies surrounding the waterfall, so many tiny pairs of iridescent wings shimmering in the mist, like flowers taking flight. Talasia wondered if the falls might be enchanted. The kingfisher seemed to sense it too. When Talasia rested the mochila on the ground, just beside the waterfall, the little bird hopped out and fluttered his wings. "Here," Talasia said, "let me help you." Kneeling down, she gently removed the bandage. The bird's wing was completely healed. he stretched out both wings, testing their strength. And he looked at Talisha with his soulful little eyes. She knew that the end of their journey would mark a new beginning for him, just as it had marked a new beginning for her. As happy as she was that they had made it this far together, her heart struggled to see him leave. And now that she had brought her kingfisher home, where was she to go? Even with questions left unanswered, Talisha herself was full of gratitude for the journey they had shared, for the kindness she'd been shown, and for her dreams taking flight. She was grateful for ocean waves, the dusty desert highway, the moonlight and mist, the rainforest and river, and for the little bird who had brought her here. In these final moments with her dear bird, she wanted to remember each glistening leaf and twisting vine, the silver spray from the waterfall, and the color of the sky that echoed the hues of the bird. Talisha stood up and strung the mochila across her shoulders. She bid farewell to her beloved friend. He hopped toward her and tilted his head just a tiny bit, seeming to say goodbye as well. And at last, she watched him open his beautiful wings for the first time since she had known him, in a swirl of copper, blue, and white. She raised her hand lovingly as he spread his wings and lifted off, rising higher into the air, soaring through a veil of mist and into the violet skies he called home.